stories that interest me are not just the sordid little stories of Hollywood. Somehow they transcend into tragedy.
Good evening. Welcome back to Between the Dial, a project where we attempt to plot a long, strange roadmap through the dark heart of Los Angeles, in the hopes of uncovering a hidden geography that sits right atop our own. Not unlike the fog up in these hills tonight. Thank you for agreeing to meet me so late, by the way. It's just that this story happens to be one that really works best at night. Perhaps even a light rain would really set the mood. Can we cue the rain? I guess not. It's always worth a shot. Especially here, and again, I thank you for coming all the way up this way. Hollywood is one thing, but crossing the threshold into Hollywood land is another thing entirely. It's a place you typically would only travel to if you were lucky enough to live here. But I wanted to start here because it's kinda where Hollywood started. That is to say, the neighborhood of Hollywood. It was the brainchild of Harry Chandler, who was the publisher of the Los Angeles Times, and certainly someone that we will delve deeper into in the future. He had a partner in the form of reoccurring character General Moses Hazeltine Sherman, who you may remember from our trip through the Sunset Strip. At the time, Sherman was the director of the Pacific Electric Railway Company. The two of them formed a sort of syndicate that linked real estate developers with tracts of land. At the time they started in 1923, plots were going for anywhere between $2,500 to $55,000, which encouraged settlers to build anything from farmhouses to actual castles. One such settler vehemently chose the latter. That settler was renowned German filmmaker F.W. Murnau, who relocated from Berlin to Hollywoodland in 1926, having signed a contract with Fox Studios. At this point in his career, Murnau had directed two certifiable works of art, films that, to this day, are lauded for their technical and artistic achievement. One was The Last Laugh, starring Emil Jannings, which, as an aside, definitely don't look up Emil Jannings' work after the fall of the Weimar Republic. But Last Laugh is a beautiful work in the Kammerspiel tradition. Basically, cinematic chamber drama. Think August Strindberg, but on film, if that makes sense. And if that doesn't make sense, then just know that it was the first film to feature a subjective POV camera angle, something that of course would become incredibly useful to slasher movie directors in the 70s and 80s. Karl Freund was the cinematographer on that project, and he would of course go on to ostensibly create the 3-camera setup for sitcoms when he was the cinematographer for I Love Lucy. Murnau's second certifiable work of art was also a giant contribution to the horror genre. F.W. Murnau directed Nosferatu, which of course was an unofficial adaptation of Bram Stoker's Dracula that came out in 1922, and has been held to this day as a masterpiece of German Expressionism. So, Murnau, after mounting a successful adaptation of Faust, decided to immigrate to the United States in 1926, after accepting an offer from Fox Studios. The first film he made for Fox was also his last great film, and that film was Sunrise, A Song of Two Humans, a piece considered to be one of the greatest films ever made. If you are not familiar with the film, then I suggest you pause this episode now and go watch it. But if you are reluctant to do so, then I'll give you the elevator pitch real quick. Sunrise is about a married farmer who falls in love with another woman. That woman then convinces the farmer to murder his wife so that they can run away together. I'll stop there because I don't want to give any spoilers. Just go watch the movie. It will make a silent film believer out of you, I promise. It was this film and Murnau's move to Fox that allowed him to build his castle in Hollywoodland. So let's take one more deep breath of this calm night air, because we're about to head downhill. For a time, Los Angeles had the only movie theater in the country to run exclusively silent films. That theater was here, on Fairfax Avenue across from Fairfax High School. It was, of course, called the Silent Movie Theater. And it always was a silent movie theater. Despite opening in 1942, which was well into the talkie era, the theater was a repository for the silent film collection of owners John and Dorothy Hampton. They would accompany the films with 78s, also from their private collection. Despite what would sound like an ultra-niche business, the silent movie theater, which was just called Movie when it first opened, was owned and operated by the Hamptons for nearly 40 years, until the audiences finally stopped coming in 1980. The theater would close in December of that year. They planned to reopen, but that never came to fruition, and John Hampton died in 1990. In fact, John Hampton died of a cancer that most attribute to the chemicals he used to custom tint and treat the films in his collection. John Hampton loved silent film, and I suppose you could say it was silent film that ultimately killed him. Not 1 year later, the theater did reopen under the auspices of Lawrence Austin, who, in addition to being a big film buff as well, was also a friend of the Hamptons. Lawrence was an interesting character, in the true Hollywood sense, in that he was given to self-mythologizing and reinvention. He told anyone that he spoke to at length that his father was a silent film actor and that his mother had been a seamstress for Cecil B. DeMille. These were both lies by all accounts, but hey. It's a harmless lie at the end of the day, and it's a nice story that lends the theater a sort of pedigree that it would not have otherwise. After purchasing the theater, he set about a full renovation, and by 1992, the theater was back in business. And so it would be until January 17th, 1997. That night, they were, of course, screening F.W. Murnau's Sunrise, a hot ticket for fans of silent film, and as such, the theater was packed. At least by silent movie standards. About 70 people or so, I hear, and Lawrence was beaming. He was out in front of the house doing the thing he loved doing, selling tickets and welcoming people to his theater. And while he was out front being the face of the company, his boyfriend, James Van Sickle, was up in the projection booth queuing up the evening's first film, a 1920 short called School Days that was to show before the main feature. The two were living the dream by most standards. One of the ticket buyers that entered the theater that night was a 19-year-old man named Christian Rodriguez. He entered the theater and sat in the very back, wearing a large trench coat and a big newsboy cap, looking not unlike Raphael going to Manhattan to catch a screening of Critters. When the lights dimmed for School Days, Christian stood up and walked into the lobby and up to Mary Giles, a young woman who was working the concession stand. His question was simple. He asked Mary if it was possible to buy tickets in advance for future shows. Mary said that she couldn't help him, but the man who could was in the ticket booth. So she walked Christian right over to Lawrence Austin. His request for advance tickets would seem extra cruel in light of what happened next. Christian, with little hesitation, pulled out the .357 handgun that he had hidden in his coat and pointed it at Larry, demanding all the money in the register. Austin complied, putting the money in a bag and passing it over to Christian. Sad to lose the take from such a big night, I'm sure, but still not willing to risk his life for it. Rather than taking the money and running, however, Christian squeezed the trigger and fired 3 shots into Larry Austin. 1 striking his leg, 1 his chest, and 1 into his head. He slumped to the floor and died, nearly instantly. He was 74 years old. Mary, the same age as Christian, 19 years old, was on the other side of the lobby, and she started screaming, to which Christian responded by fixing his aim on her and firing 2 shots into her chest. Christian realized that he needed to run. He turned towards the theater door, dropping most of the money he had gotten from the register in the process, and burst down the aisle, firing off the remaining rounds into the ceiling as he ran toward the screen and out the back door. The patrons inside the theater stood and began fleeing in terror, and while they did, Rodriguez sprinted out into the alley behind the theater and disappeared into the night. Authorities arrived and confirmed that Larry had indeed passed from his injuries. Mary Giles, on the other hand, was still alive, though deeply traumatized and unable to identify her shooter. Nor could any of the patrons in the theater, or Larry's boyfriend James from his vantage in the projection booth. All signs pointed to a textbook robbery, but a perplexing one for sure. For one, a single-screen theater isn't exactly a business that would have large amounts of cash on hand. It's an unlikely target by most robbery standards, and second, most of the money, little that there was left behind. And third, not for nothing, but running through a crowded theater firing a gun into the air is a strange way to make a getaway. if you're looking to do so without being ID'd. But, alas, a robbery it was deemed, and James was, by all contemporary accounts, devastated by the murder of his boyfriend. The theater was shut down and became an active crime scene. Almost immediately, in exploring the robbery angle, the LAPD began to poke holes in the face value details of the events of January 17th. Simply robbing the theater for the money in the register didn't seem sensical, so they began to speculate whether Christian may have been aware of some hitherto unknown assets that the theater may have possessed. In investigating this, detectives discovered that Larry actually lived in an apartment above the theater, and, much like John Hampton, was an avid collector of rare film prints. Austin's total assets, the theater and his collection, measured in the millions, to say nothing of his personal bank accounts. Was Christian perhaps after these prints? Or maybe the money in Larry's savings account? It seemed unlikely, but either way, detectives monitored the account just to make sure anything turned up. And of course, it wasn't long before something did. Someone had begun to withdraw money from Larry Austin's account after he died. This was how detectives discovered that there were two names on Larry Austin's personal accounts. His, and that of his boyfriend, James Van Sickle. Now this, in and of itself, is not terribly alarming or illegal, but it did officially establish a financial relationship between Larry and James. They continued to monitor the account, but for the time being, it was neither here nor there. Instead, the detectives put all their eggs in the basket of the surviving witness, Mary Giles, the concession stand girl. And this turned out to be the absolute correct thing to do. After recovering from her injuries, Mary was able to put together a description of her shooter, and it wasn't long before Christian was arrested. But that was only the beginning. It's cliched when talking about stories like this, with these specificities, to say things like, it was like something out of a movie. That said, the story that Christian painted was like something out of the most paranoid of noir films. Christian confessed that he did indeed commit the murder, but that he was paid to do so by none other than James Van Sickle, Lawrence Austin's boyfriend and the theater's projectionist. For doing this job, Christian was told he would be paid $25,000, plus an additional $5,000 if he killed Mary Giles. The goal of all of this, according to detectives, as well as Christian, was to make it look like the very thing it was initially thought to be: a robbery. But far more than that, James Van Sickle, according to Austin's will, stood to inherit the totality of Larry's assets, including the theater and the film collection. And this was given as the motivation for all of it. James, of course, would not inherit anything, and Christian would not get his $25,000. The two of them would instead receive life sentences, which they are both still serving to this day. Mary Giles testified at both of their trials, and it was her testimony that delivered the knockout blow to the defense. Lawrence Austin's film collection was acquired by UCLA, and his archives have led to the preservation of works that were otherwise thought to be lost to history. As a small postscript to this story, I myself have a personal history with this theater. When I first moved to Los Angeles, my girlfriend, now wife, and I would volunteer for special events at the theater, which was then owned by a group called Cinefamily. We would mainly bartend on the back patio, or check names for VIP parties, and take tickets in that infamous lobby. On several nights, I stood in the very spot where Lawrence Austin died and asked people if they wanted to join the email list. Our employee lounge was actually upstairs in what was Lawrence Austin's living room. At the time, they were trying to turn the rest of the apartment into a blacklight gallery, though I don't know if anything ever came of that. We did get to watch the results of the 2012 election on the big screen, though, during an employee party, so that was cool. Eventually, we no longer had time to give away for free, and we stopped going altogether. A few years after that, Cinefamily would shut down amid allegations of sexual harassment and abuse amongst its leadership. The theater is supposedly one of the most haunted places in Hollywood, but I myself never saw anything. And I was certainly in many situations where I feel like I would have. I was in the theater alone at one point. I was in Larry's apartment. I walked the path that Christian ran as he burst out onto the patio and served drinks to Adult Swim comedians on that very patio. But nothing. Sometimes I think that maybe I just want it too much. The theater reopened a few years later as Brain Dead Studios. It's still a theater, but it doesn't show silent movies anymore. It trades in first-run art house stuff and revival genre films. It's cool, but it lacks the novelty of a silent movie theater, in my opinion. Lawrence Austin is buried in Forest Lawn Cemetery, not too far from Tom Mix, the silent movie cowboy, which I feel is something that Larry would have appreciated. F.W. Murnau also died of unnatural causes. He was riding in a chauffeured car in Santa Barbara when a truck in the oncoming lane unexpectedly swerved into Murnau's. His car then swerved and hit an embankment and ejected all passengers. Murnau suffered a head injury and died the next day on March 11, 1931. A funeral was held for him at the Hollywood Lutheran Church on New Hampshire Avenue. Fellow German director Fritz Lang delivered the eulogy, and Greta Garbo commissioned a death mask of Murnau, which she kept on her desk for the duration of her Hollywood years. His body was transported back to Germany, where it was laid to rest in Stahnsdorf Southwestern Cemetery, near Berlin. However, he was not allowed to rest in peace. Quite the opposite. On July 15th, Murnau's tomb was broken into and his remains were, quote, disturbed. That description is a tad vague, but what that description conceals is that Murnau's skull was removed from his body and absconded with. Investigators found the wax remnants of candles, leading them to speculate that the skull may have been used in some sort of occult ritual. But beyond that, no leads have materialized. To this day, Murnau's skull has not been recovered. So if you or anyone you know has information that could lead to the safe return of F.W. Murnau's skull, then do reach out. I won't tell anyone, I promise. I just want to see it. Anyway, Are you sticking around for the film tonight? I myself am planning to take the slow drive through Laurel Canyon and head back over the hill before this fog gets too bad. But I will see you again very soon. And until then, as always, please do drive safely. Between the Dial was written and produced by me, Daniel Watkins. If, for whatever reason, you can't get enough of me talking or scary stories, then myself and Christina Santa Cruz host horror movies every Wednesday night in October and November starting at 7 p.m. Pacific Time. Head on over to landturtlerecords.com to check that out and all of the other stuff we do. That's landturtlerecords.com. And if you want to follow me on social media, I am at Epcot Fitzgerald. That's Epcot_Fitzgerald on Instagram. Have a good night, y'all.